Hello, and a warm welcome to our distinguished panelists, current and former presidents of the Caribbean Development Bank, Professor Compton Bourne and Dr. Jean Leon, and our moderator, Professor Andrew Downs. Welcome to everyone watching from across the Caribbean and indeed further afield. I am Amanda Lynch Foster, Corporate Communications Officer here at the Caribbean Development Bank, and we are thrilled to have you join us virtually today for the very first President's Chat, a new addition to our annual meeting calendar of events where our president, Dr. Leon, will engage with regional and international thought leaders on the most critical development issues facing our region. I just wanted to give a brief explanation here at the top, as we had originally been looking forward to hosting all three of our living past presidents along with Dr. Leon, but due to some unexpected eventualities, which seems to be the theme of the 2020s, they were unable to participate today. But we do look forward to them sharing the stage, whether a virtual stage or otherwise, at some other fora in the future. This new event, is the third event in our 51st annual meeting. And while we may be all feeling a bit sensitive about cricketing metaphors right now, any aficionado would know that the number 3 batsman is usually the star. And so it is only right that for this third event, we are bringing you the intellectual heft and economic insights of two of those who have led the Caribbean Development Bank. Professor Compton Bourne served as the 4th president of CDB from 2001 to 2011. He has had a professional career focused on academic economics, public policy, and institutional management, and previously served as principal of the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies, as well as Pro-Vice Chancellor for Planning and Development. He is a member of the Order of Excellence, the highest honor of the Republic of Guyana, and is currently Professor Emeritus of Economics at the St. Augustine campus. Welcome, Professor Bourne. And at the other end, we have our current and 6th president, Dr. Jean Leon. Dr. Leon has over 30 years of experience in economic development. Prior to CDB, he worked with the International Monetary Fund for over 2 decades, serving as mission chief for countries including Nigeria, the Bahamas, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, as well as senior resident representative in Jamaica. Prior to the IMF, Dr. Leon was an associate professor at State University of New York, and he has also served as director of research at the Central Bank of Barbados. Today's event will be moderated by Professor Andrew Downs. Professor Downs is a former director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, SALISIS, at the University of the West Indies. He also served as Pro-Vice Chancellor of Planning and Development at UE, and he is currently Professor Emeritus of Economics at the Cave Hill campus of the UE. And now, to get us started, I am pleased to welcome Professor Andrew Downs.
Thank you, Amanda, and good morning to all. First of all, let me congratulate Jean on his appointment and wish him all the very best. I know he's a big task ahead of him, but I'm sure that he is very, very capable. I've been knowing him for several decades over the years. And I also like to thank Compton and all the previous presidents for the work that they've done over the years in making sure that the Caribbean Development Bank has reached the standard that it's reached, and that is a well-run and well-respected organization for development banking and finance. Now, the President's chat, so to speak, they have been designed to discuss development issues facing the Caribbean region in a more informal, non-technical manner. So despite the fact that we're all high-level economists, we will try to speak in such a way that the person in the street, so to speak, or the general public can understand the nature of the development issues that the region faces. While some, as we all understand, development issues can be very complex, given the interacting nature of how various components relate to each other. We need, however, to be able to get the people of the region to understand the challenges of development that we face in a manner that they clearly can understand their role in the whole process. So, and the reason for that is that certainly the ends of development, or whatever we do at the bank and elsewhere, is really relates really to the lives and livelihoods of all individuals in the region. And therefore, they need to understand the means for which we achieve these particular development ends. So in summary, therefore, we expect the series President's Chat to be informal, as I said earlier, but also to be informative and educational, so that persons would have a clear and better understanding of the development challenges facing the region, the nature of the global environment within which these countries and region have to operate, the various mechanisms, the various policies and programs which have been proposed and implemented to resolve these particular challenges and issues. More specifically, to look at the role of the Caribbean Development Bank and other regional institutions in implementing these mechanisms, policies, and programs. And finally, for people to understand their own role in the development process, because although we have institutions doing these things, people must understand that they have a role to play in the development process, and it's clear that we need to understand that. So, thanks to Jean and Compton, we should hopefully have a very good discussion on to start this particular series off, in the sense that we will get the experience of a period of time with the bank. Now, the theme for the first particular talk is the CDB, the first 100 years. And you would ask, well, we don't look like 100-year-old people here, but certainly we want to look back, current, and look forward in the whole process. And this gives us an opportunity to reflect upon how the bank has operated since 1970, to see how the changes have taken place and how we need to reimagine the concept of the bank, and also to reposition the bank's role in the Caribbean development process. So hopefully this informal chat that we will have will situate the bank both in the present, in the past, the present, and the future going forward when we look at the whole 100 years. So the format is one in which we will have a discussion for a short period of time, and then we will open the floor to questions from various parties involved. So let's start with the reflection part of the exercise. And I always start probably from a personal level. I was lured into economics, and I'm quite sure Compton and Jean would have heard this if I had told them this. I was lured into doing economics when I first went to university in the mid-70s, by a statement to the effect that the president of the CDB is an economist. I was set out to doing accounting, and the head department at the time said to me, well, don't go and do accounting. The president of the CDB is an economist, so come and do some economics. Well, at that time, certainly I knew about commercial banks. I knew the central bank had not long been established. But development bank, I had no idea. All I know was the economist in charge. So we'll start with our first question. What distinguishes a development bank from a central bank and a commercial bank? And what is the role of a development bank in the Caribbean, such as CDB? Compton, you've been there. I want to start. You've been a teacher of ours. Well, both of you have all been teachers, but we'll start with you, Compton.
Okay. Well, I would say, Andrew, first of all, a central bank has two main functions. One is to ensure the stability of the financial system. The second main function is to help, along with other agencies of government, in ensuring the stability of the economic system. So it's a fairly narrow mandate, but a mandate with, of course, tremendous importance to the livelihoods of people in the various countries of the Caribbean. A commercial bank can be distinguished from the central bank and development banks in terms of how it gets its funds for lending. Basically, it gets deposits from the public. It can also be distinguished by its lending operations themselves, both in terms of focus and clientele. Its focus is essentially short-term loans to businesses for production purposes, and to individuals and households for consumption purposes. And I would include in that purchase of housing, mortgages. The development banks are really of two kinds in this region. They're the national development banks, which most countries have. They get their funds from government and with some small funding from bilateral aid agencies. Their lending is primarily to businesses and farms in their own countries. And that lending tends to be longer term. Now, the Regional Development Bank, the CDB, is quite different in many ways. First of all, it has a long-term focus. It is very much concerned with socio-economic objectives, that is improving the livelihoods of people. And it also has taken on some broader mandates in terms of disaster relief and revitalization of economies in the aftermath of disasters. The CDB gets its funding from shareholder capital, and the shareholders are both countries of the region that are borrowers from the bank, as well as countries outside the region that are classified as non-borrowing countries. It also goes to the international capital market to raise funds. And the third source of funds would be funds provided by various bilateral agencies in various countries. The CDB's recipients of its resources are the governments, mainly. It does have small engagement with the private sector, but the principal recipients of the funds are governments for a variety of purposes, including economic and social infrastructure. So that's the essential difference between institutions.
Thank you, Compton. So certainly the general public can just walk off the streets and come into the CDB and borrow money. I mean, that's clear. So we can see a clear distinction between the various banking operations. Gene, you have anything to?
Yeah, I guess one can add a little to this, which is whereas the commercial bank in general lends for any and every purpose, I think we should underline in a very significant way the point Compton made, that the CDB as a regional institution in essence is tasked to lend essentially for development purposes, whether it be projects or, for example, improvements in technology that has a positive impact on the, let's say, national income of states. And so I want to maybe add the one element to this that again distinguishes is the CDB from that perspective has an advisory role to play, whether it be in terms of helping governments to design or think through development policies that it can help facilitate, because that would be a difference, as it were, from the commercial space where that alignment of development and alignment of needs doesn't necessarily fit in that same mode. So I would add this as an element of the development bank, that sort of advisory, policy advice, development focus, leadership for governments that a commercial bank typically would not play. And equally, we can add also the capacity development side. The CDB, in essence, provides technical assistance, helps to develop capacity in various member states. And that's not something that you would get from a commercial bank. It's a sort of public good that the CDB would provide. And so I think that also gives one a means of seeing a difference in functionality and even in responsibility that a commercial bank would differ from the development bank.
Thanks for that. I think that clarity is important because persons will be able to understand that the agency such as the Caribbean Development Bank is a completely different type of animal to what a commercial bank, which most persons be familiar with, and the focus is clearly different going forward. Compton, to you. You were president of the bank during the time of what we economists call the Great Moderation and then the Great Recession. And therefore, clearly there would have been some major challenges with the ups and downs of the economic activity during the period you were here. Can you outline some of the challenges of running, given the definition that we've just used, give us a sense of some of the challenges involved in running a development bank in the Caribbean, especially during the 2000 period, early 2000 period. And certainly, follow up from that, are those challenges just persistent to this day, or have they changed completely?
Okay, on reflection, I would identify a few broad sets of challenges. One, given the experience of slow and lagging economic growth in the region, and given the diminished interest of the international development agencies and even countries in the Caribbean, one challenge was to ensure that the CDB helped to define the region's economic policy space. By that I mean that the CDB had to make special effort to re-articulate, help redesign the economic approach by regional governments. A second challenge, especially since development aid had begun to shift its orientation away from the Caribbean to the lesser developed countries of Africa and Asia. The challenge was to strengthen the commitment of the bank's non-borrowing member countries to the CDB, and especially to its special development program, social development program, the SDF. A third challenge was complementary, and that is the development and maintenance of a good working relationship with multilateral financial institutions, such as the IDB and the European Investment Bank, a relationship based on equality and complementarity. The fourth challenge as I saw it was adjusting the bank's operations in light of the more frequent and severe occurrences of natural hazards, such as, of course, the hurricanes which are predominant. Fifth, the bank had to make some progress in expanding its membership. There were discussions in train for accession of Haiti as a borrowing member country. But during the period, one also had to think not only in terms of borrowing member countries, but in terms of non-borrowing member countries. And a significant initiative in this respect was the starting of negotiations with the Brazilian government, headed by Lula. And the last thing I would mention is the ongoing challenge of maintaining the bank's credit rating, which is critical to its success in mobilizing funds on the international capital market. In terms of those that still persist, I would say defining the region's economic policy space is one. Another is maintaining and strengthening the relationship with non-borrowing member countries. And the third I would emphasize would be maintaining the bank's international credit status. So those are the things, Andrew, that come to my mind.
Thanks, Compton. It's very interesting because certainly managing the development process in the region is not an easy task. So listening to the Barbados Prime Minister yesterday in a presentation with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, it was clear that she has a big task on her hands, even when you now have a COVID environment to deal with. I mean, those particular issues you raised, plus having to deal with COVID. So I wonder why Jean would want to take on a position like that. So from you're here, you just joined the bank, you've had a look at it. You see any initial challenges ahead of you? I mean, so far in relation to the list that Compton had provided.
Yeah, I think I'd probably want to highlight two. The first, I think, is the point Compton made about the rating of the bank. He labeled it an ongoing issue. And I sort of remember a point made by Sir Arthur, the first president of the bank, that says, for CDB to be a bank, it has to have the means, the ability to borrow. Because you cannot lend if you cannot borrow. And I think that sums up the issue very, very well. If you cannot borrow because your balance sheet is weak, or because you don't have the confidence, the credibility of others, how they see you, then your ability to lend, to help the borrowing member countries automatically goes down. And that is separate from whether we grow the capital base, whether we extend membership. This will never be enough resources for the tremendous needs that our countries require. So our ability to borrow is significant. And so I think the point of the ratings being important and remaining on our radar is still, for me, one of the singular things we cannot afford to relax on. The second is equally something Compton raised, that I'm calling the vulnerability drag. And if we look at our mandate, the mandate talks about the harmonious growth of the member countries. Now, growth for me defines starting at one point and going to a point that is higher, better than you were. And the vulnerability drag, in my mind, is every time we have a vulnerability that is realized, whether it's a hurricane or impact of a pandemic or the global financial crisis that you mentioned, we have double duty to perform. The first part is really the recovery phase back to where we were before that event occurred. And we should not lose sight of that fact. Getting back to where we were is not growth. It is simply recovery. So that our role has to be to push us beyond where we were before, to allow you to genuinely say that you have had growth, the growth that we are talking about. And I think that is maybe the most pivotal point that I'm seized with. The magnitude of the effort to take you from the hit when a vulnerability is realized to talking about growth is 3, 4, 5 times what it would be without growth, without the vulnerability. And so given that we are so seized with the vulnerabilities we talk about, whether it is natural disasters or simply shocks from the outside, what we face is we are always losing 2 steps that we have to recover from before we can make that one step that we can talk about as growth. Right. And so consequently, the measure of how well the bank is doing in meeting that mandate, I think gets raised 2 notches, because we cannot talk about growth as recovery. It has to be beyond recovery. And hence the bar, the effort, the amount of resources, the pure tenacity with which we are going to undertake policy, I think has to be 3, 4 times more than it would otherwise. So I see those as significant challenges that at least the bank faces now and will continue to face, especially in a post-COVID environment.
Yeah. I particularly like and emphasize that point that you made about recovery versus serious growth. I mean, I think not a non-economist would think that is, as you say, just moving from A to B, where B is higher than A. But certainly it is moving that process, that production, for the productive frontier, we call it, out in the system. That's basically what we want to do in the region. And I say so because, you know, in recent times we've been hearing about the vulnerabilities that you talk about and the shocks that have occurred in the Caribbean region, where the recovery periods have been lengthening. I mean, in the early days when you had a shock, it would have been 2, 3 years, but now it's moving to 9 and 6 and even 10. And in relation to COVID, we're not sure exactly when this is going to get back up. So clearly, your point about recovery versus serious growth is something that needs to be emphasized, not only by economists, but also by politicians and also by the general public, to understand we are seeking to expand the range of goods and services, not only in terms of quantity, but also quality. There's a quality dimension to this that we want to emphasize. At the same time, provide us with reductions in poverty, increases in employment, and so on. Because I remember a statement by Sir Arthur Lewis, who always said that you should measure development by not by the level of quality employment that one achieves, which means the individual is able to improve his or her quality of living by the process. So having said that, having looked at the challenges that the bank has experienced and probably will continue to experience, the issue therefore is, if you had to identify some of the main achievements of the bank over the years, the question, what would those particular achievements be in terms of enhancing the socio-economic development of the region? Compton, you're first, you've been there, you want to look back and see what, if you had to identify a number of major achievements that you want to tell the public about, what would you say there?
My list, I guess because I have always been concerned and motivated by the situation of poor people in the region. Top of my list is the expansion of basic services to poorer communities across the region. And I would include Haiti in this, because we took special initiatives in relation to Haiti after its membership to address problems of education at primary and secondary levels. The bank was able to make great progress in this area because both Caribbean governments and the governments of the non-Borean countries made major financial commitments to the Special Development Fund, which is the vehicle for financing all those things. The second achievement, I thought, is the bank's major contribution to building and strengthening the economic and social infrastructure of the Caribbean. You know, it made a tremendous contribution to expansion of education facilities, health facilities, transportation, water supply, you're right across the range of economic and social infrastructure facilities, which are critical to future economic growth and development. Thirdly, I think it engaged successfully in stabilization of Caribbean economies in times of crisis. And I think of several of these, and it did so again by pioneering some new instruments like the policy-based lending or policy-based loans, which allowed it to give budgetary support to governments at critical times. I would also say an achievement was inducing development partners like the Inter-American Development Bank and the European Investment Bank to expand their own operations in the Caribbean. Fourth was the bank's successes in providing relief and recovery finance in the aftermath of natural disasters. And I take fully Jean Leon's point that one always has to go beyond recovery. Right. One has to ensure incremental growth. Right. So those are the kinds of the things I would say were achieved in the period. There are many other things, but I think those were the highlights.
Okay, thanks. I'm glad you mentioned those because certainly the Caribbean region has done well. And I keep saying this. In fact, I usually start off my discussions on papers by saying that from an international perspective, the Caribbean region has a very high profile on the economic and social front to compare other regions, both in terms of whether you look at the Human Development Index, whether you look at the Global Competitiveness Index, and so on. So certainly there will be a number of agencies, institutions that have helped us to move from what we would have seen or what we would have had, let's say, in the 1960s to where we are now in 2020. So clearly one can say that the bank has done a lot, particularly from the point of view, as you said, from financing and also provide the policy advice and direction that is needed going forward. So, Jean, if you would have applied to come to be president, and you would have said, well, I want to go further than that. Having looked at the bank itself, what do you see any other achievements that you think you want to highlight beyond what Compton would have mentioned in the process?
I think Compton's summary, as he called them, highlights whether it's on the basic needs trust fund and the response to crises clearly stand out. But I think two areas that we should not lose sight of that are incorporated there is the bank has been adaptable. I think that's a point we should not lose sight of. Adaptable in the sense that it has transformed, it has recognized the need of the countries and adapted its entire policy focus to help the development of the region over time. So I think that we should not downplay that, because we could easily well have had an institution that was very rigid, that did not see that need to be responsive, and we would not have been saying, I think, those very points that Compton raised. The second, I think, is, and it falls within, in a sense, adaptability as well, is the bank seizing, especially in the, let's call it second half of the period we are talking about, the bank seizing of the opportunity to grow partnerships. Right. whether it is with the IDB, with the EIB, or with the UK in terms of the infrastructure fund, as a means of supplementing its reach, its resources, mobilizing that to be able to help the region more. These are areas I think clearly we can do a lot more in, and areas I think we would like to continue to focus on, but they should stand out as achievements. Right. That the bank at least saw the need, the rationale for doing this, pushing it, and being successful at it. And I think if we can see that opportunity of expanding our resource base through strategic partnerships of all forms, then I think the bank will be even more successful in its adaptiveness with regard to meeting the changing needs of the borrowing member countries.
Right. Yeah. Right. Thanks. I'm glad that you put it that way, because certainly, and I'll come to adaptability in a moment. Therefore, when we reflect upon the bank, you can clearly see that it's had its challenges, but certainly it has been able to adapt to those and modify its workings to those challenges over time, and has been a major achievement certainly for the region. In fact, one can argue that in addition to other regional institutions, one of which I was associated with, and so is Compton, there have been highlights of regional integration and strong institutions that we've had, the UWI, CDB, and others. So we're up front. So that reflection gives us a chance and opportunity, even in the context of adaptability, that the region and also the world is facing new challenges. We have COVID and everything that's associated with COVID taking place now. We have the issue of climate change. We have, you call it, we have major challenges. And the question, therefore, arises is that what out there that you see would force the CDB to reimagine itself? That is, when in the 70s it was conceptualized, there was a sort of thought process involved, an imagination, a view as to where the bank will go in terms of different things. We've seen where they've made particular headway and achievements in relation to poverty reduction, enhancing the social and economic infrastructure of the region, dealing with governments in their economic and macroeconomic management programs and so on. But now we have a new set of issues, development issues that are confronting us. And the question arises, out of the whole mountain of issues, development issues that we are currently confronting, and what do you see as the main ones that would force the bank to rethink or reimagine its view of things as part of that adaptability process? Jean, you're in the hot seat
now. I think, Andrew, we can start from the position that the bank was set up to facilitate the harmonious growth of the borrowing member countries. And so a natural starting point is to say, how much have those countries grown? Yeah. And I think despite the previous question, where we say the bank has had successes, I think it would not be lost on anyone that we as a region have not grown as much as we ought to have grown. Now, part of this, I understand, we can all say is this vulnerability drag that we spoke of. Part of it is we have structural deficiencies that we have not been able to overcome. Part of it is we are not necessarily as productive as maybe competitors out there are. And so I think looking forward to me is, can we sit back and say the growth that we have experienced is sufficient, is adequate, is what we would want the legacy for our grandchildren to have and own And I think the answer is, for me at least, clearly no. And if that answer is no, then the question really is, where would we like to see us ending? Right. And hence why I think the idea of the first, you talked of, we are not yet 100 years, but the first 100 years, if we were to look back, having been 100 years, what would we think could be the pivot, the anchor that we would like our countries to be? And I think three things probably stand out to me. One is we clearly would want to be resilient economies. And I'd like to come back to that. The second is, I think we want to have some sense of sustainable livelihoods, where our people are not struggling in excess poverty. I mean, that would have to be a marker of success. I think we would equally want to be in a point where we can drive an external force. And there I think we can be innovators. So that we can even aspire to be exporters of capital, not the traditional importers of capital. And the fourth, I think I would want at the end of the time is, could we really say we have breached the digital divide and talk about a region of complete connectivity? Now, if we can think of those as markers where we could say, if we were in 2070, 100 years, would those be things that we could have achieved? Then I think if we can agree on that, then we have every reason to start pivoting from where we are today to say, what do we need to do to get to that vision going forward? So I think that would be my kind of opening line here. There is ample room to say we need to pivot. And what may be some of the desirable things we need to pivot to, and then there'll be the bigger question of how we actually get there.
Compton, any additions to that view?
Yes, in fact, they say economists don't think alike, but I think in this case there's close identity in thoughts.
Right.
Because top of my list in reimagining the future is, in fact, the growth issue. You see, I think that one would hope that the Caribbean, when we look at it, 20, 30 years from now, would be a region in which the growth, the economic growth trajectories of the countries is much higher, shifted higher. Because we know that for the last 30 years, we've had slow growth, unsteady growth, and sometimes prolonged economic decline. So that one would hope that when we look back 30 years from now, that will not be the scenario. And I also agree on the question of resilience. I think there are two important dimensions to this in terms of the shocks that we experience. The region economies experience external economic shocks, and it experiences shocks coming from the natural hazards. In a way, we cannot do much about the external economic shocks in terms of preventing them. But we can build our economic structures in such a way that we can moderate the impact of those shocks. For instance, ensuring that budgetary resources contain provisions for ameliorating the harmful effects on the, let us say, the less advantaged members of our societies. With respect to the natural hazard shocks, I don't think the region has done a very good job we are still too heavily focused on relief and recovery and not sufficiently focused on building structures which minimize our vulnerability to the shocks. One has to think in terms of sea defenses, our building codes, our land settlement patterns, and things like that. We have really not significantly addressed those things. And I hope that 30 years from now, one would not be making the same kind of statement and go around the world seeking funds for disaster relief and recovery. I also think that we need to ensure that 30 years or even 20 years now, we have a more robust private sector. And a private sector that is more diverse in terms of its composition. Instead of having just a few large conglomerates within countries and across the region, we have a middle sector that is vibrant, and a small business sector that is also vibrant. And I think that this is something that the CDB can help to bring about. The last point I would mention is that we need our agencies like the CDB and the CARICOM Secretariat, for instance, to do a continued job in brokering and international intermediation on behalf of the CARICOM countries. Sometimes institutions like the CDB, because it stands a little apart from the policy-making arms of governments, is better situated to interpret the intentions and constraints to international agencies and development partners. And of course, to do the same thing in the opposite direction, and hopefully bring about a greater concordance of views and action.
Okay, thanks. So we seem to be converging towards a set of measures that certainly the region would have to, or these goals that the region would have to follow, seek to achieve. This raises the question, therefore, we have heard of the Washington Consensus and the whole question of a set of economic policy measures that countries should follow. I don't want us to reinvent the Washington Consensus, but certainly we want to get a sense from you as presidents, both past and current, what sort of key elements, key advice you will want to provide to the governments of the region to achieve those goals that we've just outlined of enhanced growth, resilient economies, and so forth. And I say so because writings by, say, Terence Farrell and Delay World point to the same issues that we've identified. The whole question is that issue that the region has been underachieving or underperforming. I mean, they've actually, Terence has written a book on that issue of underachievement of Trinidad and Tobago, and Delay has written on the issue of Barbados' case underperforming. So we seem to be well within the production process with the frontier of development. So the question arises, what sort of, if you had to identify two or three key things you want the governments to follow upon as development advice, what would you suggest? Compton, you want to start first?
Well, I was gonna allow the man in the hot seat to go first.
I can go. It's okay.
No problem. I want to shelter him to the wrath of the ministers. Yeah, go on, Gene.
Let me probably just go back a little, I think, to 2 points we have raised. If we have to achieve sustainable and inclusive growth, the metaphor that comes to mind is we need to be able to continue to remain at a level as if we are flying. We are not going to fall. We need to remain flying. Now, if we are to remain flying, it means we cannot afford to drop. Cannot afford to drop says we need to be resilient. Because the moment we start to drop, we are losing pressure. We need to be able to bounce back. So resilience is a key element that I think has to underlie everything we do going forward. The second is, if we again sticking to that same analog we are looking at, analogy we are looking at, part of a plane cannot fall. The whole plane falls. And so we need to see this as a holistic concept. You cannot slice it and say, I'm only going to keep part of the plane flying. A whole plane flies or not. And so what's coming out of this for me in terms of messaging is we have to see that development focus as a integrated, holistic concept. In some cases, we hear of the don't leave any child behind, don't leave any country behind. But thinking about it holistically, don't leave any development focus behind. And so resilience, for me, is a bigger term. Resilience in the social space, whether it's in health and education, resilience in institutional building. Strengthening, for example, not just the way the private sector operates, but how the public sector operates. Strengthening our ability to withstand vulnerabilities, whether it be on the building of reserves or mitigation or prevention elements, if it is possible to be able to do that. And equally, resilience in the overall economic space, which is a policy issue that I think governments have to be able to embrace. Right. But beyond all of that, maybe two words come to mind. One is, I think, collaboration. We have to embrace the share to grow mentality, that growth mindset that says we cannot continue to behave as little atoms. We have to see the integratedness of the region as a key element of us going forward. And the corollary to that collaboration is integration itself as a means to an end, not an end, a means to an end has to be embraced, I think, by all of our governments. I think it is only in that way we can really talk about the sharing to grow, see the benefits of the different synergies that can exist, how we can learn and grow together as a means of advancing this broad resilience that we are talking about and the innovation that should go with it to allow us to actually grow. So I would say those three words, resilience, collaboration, and integration, I think to me are three messages. I would think if we are to say how do we go forward, these would have to be words that would resonate to me with the entire political and broad societal mix.
Yeah. Good. Thanks very much. Compton, you want to add any points to that?
Yes, I'm glad that Gene brought up the integration issue because it's one of the things that I had forgotten to mention as something that the bank has been very much involved in. And I think that it is important to revitalize Caribbean integration and I think pointing to it or viewing it as a means and end is probably the best way to do that, instead of positing it as a goal that has its value on its own right. I have a couple of relatively mundane things, or maybe one is not so mundane. I think that in this area we talk about collaboration across the region. I would also speak about the importance within countries of building consensus on major development policy strategies. There will always be differences on the specific means adopted in pursuit of strategies. But I think if we could achieve a consensus on the major policy strategies, I think we will be laying a better foundation for the future. So one of the things I would suggest then to governments is that some more attention be paid to this particular issue. I think also a better balance has to be achieved between expenditures by government on consumption type of things and public investment. One of the unfortunate things throughout the region is, especially when there is an economic shock, the adjustment takes the form of largely reducing public investment, which had previously been afforded a high importance, so that growth suffers, the capacity to grow suffers as in that adjustment to the external economic shock. We have to achieve a better balance between preserving the consumption side of the elements of the budget and not sacrificing the investment elements in the budget. And I think also there has to be a continuous effort, I mean, with no relenting, on seeking to achieve greater efficiencies in delivery of social programs. Once you accept the goal of addressing the social issues, the disadvantages of marginalized groups, but we can do so in a much more efficient manner than we have tended to do. And I think this requires careful and sustained attention. So those are the rather micro type things, if you like, that I think of in addition to what Jean has said.
Beautiful. Very good. I think certainly we're coming to a break shortly. So I just want to focus quickly on the whole question of the repositioning of the bank. Given what we have, there is a question, we'll have an opportunity to have questions from the wider viewing public. But certainly the question to you, Jean, is given what you've heard so far in terms of Compton and so on, can you give us a synopsis of how would you want to reposition the bank to achieve and to do the things that we've been hearing so far?
I'd say two points which we've made, but maybe it's worthwhile repeating. We do not have a sufficiently vibrant private sector that's driving the region yet. And so I think that will be one repositioning, pivoting point that I think the bank should look at and look at closely. How do we facilitate that? How do we, it's not just a matter of financing, but how do we encourage, whether it's through policy advice or through being an innovation, almost incubator type function? How can we help governments shape the environment within which that private sector can function and function better? And that I think is a big chunk of that repositioning. And it's important because it is not so much about government directing, neither it is so much about the private sector going it alone. But the point that Compton ended with, which is building that consensus across society, beyond the political, including the private sector and the general public, a consensus on where we would like to be, and then the public sector and the private sector identifying jointly with that particular goal, such that they can both do what they are supposed to do, but do it with a common purpose in mind. And that common purpose is what will, I think, working on their own as independent units, that facilitation is what will actually, I think, give us a means to pivot on that private sector development. So that's sort of one big chunk. The second big area, I think, of pivot relates to the whole vulnerability resilience aspect. I think our focus should be squarely on being literally a catalyst, a facilitator of that repositioning towards resilience. And resilience with a view to shifting the mindset away from reactive firefighting to more structured planning, structured mitigation efforts as a means of not trying to anticipate, we'll never be able to do that, but positioning us in a way that would minimize, reduce the impact of the various vulnerabilities that have stymied our ability to grow beyond this recovery that we are saying we are stuck in. And so I think those two, for me, would be key areas that I would like as a repositioning, pivoting way that we could focus. Of course, the details will flow from that, but if we could see those as two key areas going forward, that for me would clearly define a large segment of how we reposition ourselves going forward.
Thank you very much, Gene. At this point, I think we'll take a short break, I think. Is that the... continue? Okay, right. So we can continue the discussion. We have some questions from the audience, the viewing audience, and we'll take those in a moment. But I just want to follow up on a issue that was raised by both of you, and this is a question of regional cooperation. The involvement of regional partners such as University of the West Indies, CARICOM, Secretariat, OECS, and so on. And the issue then arises, how do you see these other regional institutions working with the private sector and other development partners in the region as part of CDB's repositioning process? Gene, you want to?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew, for this. I think this is super, super important because it brings out the idea of the region as an ecosystem. First in national space, but also in a regional space. And it is that interaction of the ecosystem which underpins, when I talk of collaboration and integration, as means to getting us somewhere. And in a sense, the collaboration that is embedded in that statement touches on the point you made. We have to forge a forum, not a talk shop, but a more action-oriented group that will include a CARICOM because of its reach, because of the trade dimension, a CDB because of the focus on development policy, on lending on key infrastructure type areas, has to include the OECS Commission because of now the broader political mandate for economic cooperation among the small OECS region. We have to have the UWI as the educational element that will bridge the skill sets required for the private sector to be able to operate going forward in the future. And we have to bring in the central banks of the region now as financiers, payment systems of the region that now can facilitate not only the government side, but equally the broader arrangements that hold in keeping our economies ticking. So I think we have to see those institutions at the minimum, and we cannot forget the private sector. We need to find a way of bringing in representatives of the private sector into that mix, but a grouping of that nature that can, in principle, begin to influence, because of size and mass, how the broader public, including the political directorate, sees and acts on development going forward. So that it is not just CDB, not just CARICOM, maybe not just the UWI, but all combined. I think we can benefit from that strength of mass as a means of saying there is thought leadership, there is advice, there is influence that can, in principle, help drive the agenda going forward. So that I see as a key element that we would need to engineer, put together, and start that process of moving the region into the next 50 years.
Beautiful. I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are three questions that have come in which all point to that sort of approach. I'll give you all three as they've come, so that we can I kind of condense them. But the first one is we talk about mindset, and I think it has to be first in the mind. I mean, those who have done behavioral economics will tell you, well, psychology of persons is critical. So the first question is, how do we change the mindset of our policymakers towards economic integration? That's number one. So you can think about how we change the mindset of policymakers. Secondly, how do we integrate our efforts to ensure economic growth? I think we've tackled elements of that, but may want to reemphasize that particular point. And the third related question is, in the context of the need for deepening the integration of the region, Lewis that is, was a proponent of the development role of the bank to treat with the failure of federalism. What could be the current role of the bank in this process? I think we've touched on elements of these, but I think the central point here is, what role can and I think Compton raised it, the whole question of what role can the CDB play in the economic integration process from the point of view of changing mindsets, getting the growth process and not only recovery process up, but getting the growth process, getting more people employed and so on, and also to help strengthen the integration process, the collaborative process, the partnerships that we've been talking about. So that's a question that has come in from the chats. Any response? Compton, you want to go first, and then give Gene a thought.
All right. Let me begin with the CDB in relation to the integration process, because Jane will be thinking how to shape that role in the future, but I can speak to how the bank has tried to operate in the past. One of the ways which Lewis and others had identified, and it was particularly prominent during the time of William Demas, was some preferential attention to the so-called lesser developed countries of the Caribbean, basically the OECS countries. And that was reflected in the bank's loan portfolio and several other things it did. So it was trying to, if you like, equalize the economic situation of countries in the region. And the larger countries, the so-called more developed countries, were fully on board with that approach. Another element was the bank's participation in the deliberative forums of CARICOM, producing reports and a memorandum for advice on major issues, like, for instance, on the Regional Development Fund, which was finally created, producing reports on stabilization, a stabilization fund in the times of acute economic crisis in the middle of the, around about 2008, participating in the deliberations and preparing reports on how best one might finance the CARICOM Secretariat itself. You know, we did a report on the automaticity of financing in CARICOM, and and of course the bank's major involvement in the mobilizing funds for the Caribbean Court of Justice, where in fact the bank took the lead in making sure that there was a funding arrangement that was feasible and could be operationalized. So there are a number of direct ways of involvement which have taken place in the past, and I would imagine that in the future the bank would continue to be an important part of those deliberative forums, providing the benefit of its specialized knowledge of both the wider international environment in the economic and financial field, as well as its wide regional appreciation of the economic situations of individual countries. Now, on the mindset issue, that is I don't know. I don't know. Partly because obviously governments respond to pressing economic and political issues at the domestic level. And this creates difficulties in operationalizing things that they have agreed to in the past. Very often there's no disagreement on the principle of various policies and actions to bring about closer economic integration of the Caribbean. Very often the difficulty is getting consensus for those at home and having the bureaucratic capacity to put them into effect. I mean, if one thinks of, for instance, the issue of the movement of people and the question of university graduates as being given preferential rights of entry, this has encountered many, many obstacles in different countries depending on bureaucratic capabilities. So that's a difficult question, and as we know, it takes time to massage political differences and political interests and considerations into common purpose across countries. I leave the economic growth issue to Jean.
Well, I've given Jean enough time to think through. So because he will be in the hot seat going forward, so therefore the question arises, you've heard the questions, how do we deal? But the challenging one, I think, is the mindset, because we've heard in the region when it comes to economic integration, the whole question of what is common as a cliche now, implementation deficit. Right. We agree to things and then later on, somehow, years later on, they don't happen. So how can you deal with these particular as CDB president?
Yeah, I think the first part of doing this is getting the mindset right. And the mindset for me is one of acceptance. I don't know if we have accepted where we should be. And when I say accepted, I don't know if we own that acceptance.
Right.
So much so that I would argue one of the first points I think I would like the region to embrace is that CDB is our bank, our institution, not just an institution that you have capital in, an institution that you believe is yours, there to assist, there to help you, there to promote where you are going forward. And I think if we don't start there, then you don't have the basic trust, you don't have the confidence to implement the bold leadership that is expected and required to move the needle, and you don't have the confidence to say, now is the time. What we end up doing is we punt, we delay, we are not sure, because we don't have that first acceptance of ownership. So I think that's the first hurdle. How we do that, I think in large part is going to be a function of a very strong communications program, a communication strategy that goes beyond just speaking to the policymakers. It goes to the heart of communicating with the wider region at all levels. The private sector, the policy directorate, the civil society, the person who just has a passing, fleeting interest on anything Caribbean or anything regional, that they can begin to identify, I am Barbadian, I am St. Lucian, I am Guyanese, but first and foremost, I am a regional person. We speak, the vernacular is still, I'm going foreign. If I'm going from Trinidad to Grenada, why should it be foreign? It's not really going overseas in the same sense of going foreign. This is the region. We don't have that sense. And if I can sort of look back, and Compton will correct me, Andrew, if I'm wrong, the sense of pride that we had at the time, let's say pre-federation, or the sense of pride even on the cricket team, the sense of pride of a UE at the time when UE didn't have the 3-4 separate campuses in terms of definition. That was an opportunity that bonded, that created this regional sense that I don't think is, at least not at the same level of intensity that we had then today. And so that for me is the first starting point, because if we are there, we can begin to see how we forge a political and private people consensus on the need for this integration, on the need for an identity of the region. And that has to be your first starting point. Now, if we start there and we make progress there, then the economics, I think, falls into place. Because we can now make the link that this sustainable, inclusive growth that we are looking at as our endpoint is going to rely on resilience. And resilience can only come about if we can innovate. If we can innovate. So innovation becomes the driver in all dimensions of resilience as a means of taking us forward. And the moment you start thinking innovation, you realize it is a process of knowledge that is going to be reinterpreted, and from which strategies of change and improvement flow. And that process of innovation is quite clear, will be 10 times better if we can share, 10 times better if we can harness synergies, 10 times better if we can get scale efficiencies from a regional than an individual part, and 10 times better if we go it at the same time. The power of unity, the power of togetherness is what will actually help us make that bridge of saying we are moving from where we are to a stronger economic space that we talked about as the end goal. And so I see the things as linked. But that mindset has to be first. And if we get the mindset right, then I think the rest can actually follow.
Yeah. I think that is critical. I mean, both in terms of communication and language.
Yeah.
You know, what it is. We're having a lot of submissions from the chat coming in to us. Not sure we can cover all of them, but let me go back to some of the original ones. Given the situation in most of the countries today, technology, climate change, international trade, should the bank not take on the role of mounting a Marshall Plan for the region? That's one. Two, the distinction between, so the question, first one is, should we have a Marshall Plan? The second one, the distinction between recovery and growth phases is an important one. Any comments on what this implies for the segmentation of funding to support these different phases, that is, support recovery versus growth? I mean, I think that's the argument being used there. And there is one other I want to add to that list. Well, let's do this one. To achieve the critical consensus of which the President speaks, isn't it also critical that the regional private sector be engaged in a structured manner? I think that as far as I'm aware, that is now in place within the CARICOM setting. There's now a regional formation association to deal with private sector thing. That's something that was there before and seem to be coming back now. But so those are the three issues. One in relation to the Marshall Plan, two in relation to the segmentation of funding, recovery versus growth, and secondly, and thirdly, sorry, the one which deals of engaging the private sector.
Let me maybe take the second question. I think the Marshall Plan idea, concept is linked to a consensus vision of tomorrow. If we can agree on a consensus vision, then you in a sense have where your Marshall Plan ought to be targeting. What are the anchors? What are the goalposts that you're looking for? So almost automatically the answer to that is maybe yes. We do need a good, strong, clearly articulated consensus vision of where we want to go as a people, as a region. So I think if you can call that a Marshall Plan, I think the answer to that is categorically yes. Okay. But the second part about segmentation of financing, while it is useful, and I'm using that phrase useful, to separate the reimagining component, which is where we say we would like to be, from the literally rebalancing element, the beginnings of recovery, and the repositioning to the end goal of where that Marshall Plan ought to end. We cannot separate them. They are not little buckets that you do, and after you achieve one, you get to the other. And the reason why you cannot separate them is whatever you do in, take for example now, rescue mode under COVID-19 will have an impact on the recovery. Yeah. And it will equally have an impact on the repositioning post-recovery. So you have to keep in mind all three buckets as being simultaneous, even if your focus is on one or the other. So you're always looking to adjust your financing, adjust your priorities, adjust your focus, but they have to be integrated always in the sense that they flow one into the other so that you end up with where you would like to be, that anchor of the Marshall vision that you're talking about, whatever the end point that you are interested in.
Compton, any quick comments you want to make on that?
Well, just to say that I agree fully with what Gina said, particularly this articulation of the integration of the relief, recovery, and growth elements. On the private sector, I do agree with the person who raised the question that the private sector engagement in the CARICOM forums need to be a lot more structured than it has been so far. Like you, I've seen the reports coming out of recent meetings about engaging them. I would hope that it turns out to be a lot more meaningful than previous attempts at doing so. You see, I think many of our countries still do not see the private sector as a critical partner in the formulation of economic policies and strategies. And one clear example of this is when some countries mount international trade missions or international economic missions. It is not very usual for the private sector to be invited to be part of those missions. And we need to engage the private sector, make them formal members of the various committees in the region that we identify as important for economic and social development.
Yeah, thanks, Compton. I think that brings us to the end of the session, and there's still 1 or 2 questions that have come in. Oh, we still have a few more minutes. We have a few more minutes? A few minutes? Yeah, okay. We can answer one in particular. This deals with the whole question. How can the CDB help with the regional financial and economic stability using new innovative instruments that act as shock absorbers? And related, what about cryptocurrency? Many banks are allowing these transactions. Will it be the norm? Will we see where many other countries are embracing it? So the 2 questions relate to how about innovative instruments for financial instruments and the whole issue of digital and cryptocurrencies. Any quick comments on that? Who wants to go first?
Okay, I can start.
Okay.
I think the issue is more innovation of financing as opposed to innovation of financing instruments. And the reason why I say this is financing is, as it were, a flow concept.
Right.
But you inherit a stock and you develop and accumulate a stock from that flow. And normally when we talk of financing instruments and innovation in those, and I think the question posed the question of buffers,
right,
or if you want instruments that can take care of certain, let's say, shocks.
Right.
That can only at best handle the shock change in stock component. But what even if you did that and you had an instrument that, for example, eliminated, for example, the debt issue that you have now?
Right.
Does that solve your financing problem? It does not. It gives you relief. It changes your number space, but it still does not address the flow of financing. And so when I say innovation in financing, as opposed to innovation in financing instruments, what I think we need to be thinking of generally is innovation across the space of how do I mobilize finance, how do I manage the particular space I am in, whether it is high debt, how do I manage my reaction to or how I manage shocks. disasters, relief, postponement, deferments of payments, and how do I get now access to new financing to meet all of the development needs that we are talking about. And if you focus on one slice, which is just that relief component, absolutely, whatever we can come up with is good. Yeah. We should not, let's not diminish that. It's good. But we cannot lose sight that it's a bigger problem that you need to address under the banner of innovation in financing.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I think certainly what is summarized that the bank certainly will be engaged in some degree of innovative financing.
Yes, absolutely.
That's
absolutely.
Clear. Amanda, over to you.
All right, well that brings us to an end to today's event, but definitely not an end to the discourse. The engagement and the questions have been really heartening. So thank you so much to everyone who watched today for your questions, for your engagement. We could have gone on longer, but unfortunately we have to come to a close. This has been a very enlightening and thought-provoking discussion. Thank you so much to President Dr. Leon, to past President Professor Bourne, and of course to our moderator, Professor Downs. We look forward to hosting other such fora in the future. And in the meantime, you can join us on Thursday, June 24th, for the second seminar of our annual meeting, which will be entitled Climate Action in a Post-COVID-19 Environment. And we look forward to hosting you then. Have a good day.